Tēnā koutou katoa, everybody. Welcome along to this webinar brought to you, of course, by the Water Services Authority, Taumata Arowai. You know that, and today we'll be looking at the downstream supplies. Let me introduce myself. My name's Tim Cadogan. I'm the engagement specialist here at the Authority, and I'll be joined today by Charlene Maslin, who is the senior policy or a senior policy advisor here, alongside Peter Wood, who is a principal technical advisor. He'll run through a session of slides, obviously, and from there, there'll be the opportunity for you to ask your questions. Questions, please, in the Q&A. The chat's actually been disabled. And one of the handy features of the Q&A that the good people at Microsoft have thought of is that if you read a question in there and you think, hey, that's actually a really good question, you can uptick it, and that way it'll get pushed to the top of the list. Some magic will happen, and it'll be more likely that that question will be asked. This has been a lot of work for a large team here at Taumata Arowai over a long period of time. So it's great to get things underway and to be able to share what we've been working on with you all today. So a very big thank you for your attendance, giving up your lunch hour to be with us today. So hopefully, all things being equal, you should be seeing on your screen the Downstream Supplies Policy Statement Update. I'm sure someone will tell me if you're not. And we'll begin with karakia. Whakataki te ho ke te uru, whakataka te ho ke te tonga, kia makina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai, ehi aki ana te ata kura, he tio he huka, he ho, ti he Māori ora. Welcome, everybody. So what are we going to cover today? The background to the policy statement, what we heard through engagement, when a downstream supply exists, what responsibilities apply, and what happens next. And that really is enough from me. So I'll introduce you to Charlene Maslin, who will take us through the first part of this presentation. Kia ora, Charlene.
Unmute. Kia ora, Tim. Thank you for the introduction. So today we're talking about downstream supplies and the policy statement that we've recently published on our website. So what do we mean by downstream supplies? At a high level, we're talking about when a supplier receives drinking water from another supplier and then on supplies drinking water to others, so either to the end consumers or in some cases to another supplier. The difficulty that we've been faced with is that the Water Services Act is relatively unclear around when a particular arrangement is a supplier in its own right or when it's simply a consumer. So this work responds to feedback from you, from the wider sector. We've been getting queries for a few years now where we've heard that there's uncertainty around whether a particular arrangement is a supplier or not, and people wanting to know, do they need to register? And if they do, what are their responsibilities under the Act? And we know that being a supplier brings with it costs and responsibilities. And so understandably, it's something that you want clarity on. So the aim of this policy statement is to clarify when is it that a downstream supply exists and what responsibilities apply. We're aiming to reduce uncertainty, support consistent decisions, and I think most importantly from our side is ensure that risks to drinking water are being managed appropriately and in a proportionate way. Just next slide, please. So the policy statement, what it does at a high level is it sets out key features to help you yourself identify whether you operate a downstream supply. The focus of it is on public health risk. And one thing we wanted to acknowledge is it may not pick up every situation. We've heard in our engagement and in our queries over the last few years of a range of scenarios and where, if you find reading the policy statement that it doesn't answer your questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We've got some email addresses at the bottom of this slide that you can contact us on if you do have questions. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly cover what we heard through sector engagement. So in late last year, we proposed some factors and scenarios to help guide decision making on when a downstream supply could exist, and then we asked you for feedback on them. We went out separately to international ports and airports, and the reason for that is they've got their own particular international regulatory regime, and we wanted to help understand whether they should continue to be consumers or whether international ports and airports should be suppliers under our legislation. After we went out for with our discussion document, we also had a webinar and some drop-in sessions where people could come to us and discuss their particular scenarios. And the purpose of that was to see if what we proposed could be refined or added to. So this slide here just kind of highlights what we heard at a high level from our engagement. So overall, submitters supported Taumata Arowai taking a clear risk-based position that clarified when a downstream supply exists and what the distinction was between suppliers and consumers. We heard really strongly that there was a need for clarity and that public health risks should be managed, but also that any policy statement should minimise unnecessary compliance costs. Overall, submitters supported a downstream supply existing when additional treatment was installed, but we heard that there was more clarity needed around what we meant by a significant network risk. So more clarity around what is extensive storage, what do we mean by distribution or backflow risk, and that was needed to kind of give people more certainty. A few other things that came through was that we should be taking a consistent approach to similar sites with similar risk profiles, and that more guidance would be helpful. So one area that came up was around managing the risks of storage. And next slide now, please. And just go on one more. So this next section is, I'm going to cover the first part and then I will hand over to Peter. So this slide, this just covers at a really high level what our policy statement says around when a downstream supply exists. So a downstream supply is where a supplier receives drinking water from another upstream supply. Then that supplier supplies drinking water to others, so either consumers or other suppliers. A really important factor is that the supplies are owned by different people. Next, that additional treatment exists or is needed to make the drinking water safe, or the site has one or more specific network risk factors. So we're going to go on the next few slides, kind of cover that and unpack it in a bit more detail. So I'm going to cover the additional treatment side, and then I'll hand to Peter, who'll discuss significant network risk. So our policy statement just sets out when additional, what we mean by additional treatment. So it includes primary disinfection, residual disinfection, coagulation, sedimentation and filtration, and also endpoint treatment at a consumer's property if an acceptable solution is being followed. And it can also include aseptic treatment. So if there is a risk that drinking water could become unsafe if the treatment is not being applied appropriately. And in the policy statement, we give the specific example of potassium permanganate. Next slide, please. Peter's smiling because I managed to pronounce it correctly this time. So these next few slides, I'm just going to give a couple of illustrated examples of additional treatment. These are based on real life scenarios that we've heard of. They won't cover every single situation, but they are kind of reflective of common scenarios. So in this first example, you'll see on the top left of the diagram that we have a mixed-use rural supply. And in this particular example, the farmhouses are following an acceptable solution, and the mixed-use rural supply also provides raw water to a town and that town has centralised treatment in place. So in this particular example, the mixed-use rural supply is an upstream supply, and the town is a downstream supply, and that's because obviously they have put in place centralised treatment to ensure that the drinking water being provided to consumers is safe. Next slide, please. So in this example, on the left-hand side, we have the upstream supply, and in this case, this is an industrial site that is connected to a town. So the industrial site actually has centralised treatment in place, but the town has added in further treatment. So in this case, that's residual disinfection, and due to the size and the complexity of the network or specific risk features that are there, residual disinfection is needed to ensure that the drinking water remains safe. So in this example, the industrial site is an upstream supply, and the town will be a downstream supply. Next slide, please. So we're now just going on to significant network risks. So I'm just going to hand to Peter at this point. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Charlene. Yes, so when we're thinking about network risks, we're really considering those things that can adversely affect the drinking water before it gets to the household or the final user. So if there is certain infrastructure that connects the supply pipework to the ground surface, that can be subject, can cause or introduce risks that need to be managed. So for example, something like a fire hydrant or a scour valve, where somebody can come along and exercise that valve and either release a whole lot of water or otherwise do things that affect the water supply, that would be a significant network, significant risk. We've also identified certain things like pumps and pump stations and pressure reducing valves, especially if they reduce the pressure below a level that will provide safety. We have identified extensive storage of drinking water, so every tank, every storage facility for treated water can be a vulnerability due to hatches that can be left open, due to air vents, due to overflows. Now, we have identified extensive storage as an equivalent to 24 or more hours of supply for the entire network. So we're not thinking of a little small balance tank, but we're thinking of something that is reasonably substantial. Although, because we're talking about an entire network, the size of the network will determine how extensive that or how big that storage will be. The key thing to consider here is that we're talking about storage, network storage, so we're not talking about household storage. In a lot of rural areas, every house will have their own little storage tank that may or may not be supplemented by roof water or rainwater. Those are part of the consumer's infrastructure. The extensive storage we're thinking about is for the supply and does not include the consumer's infrastructure. Next slide, please. So if there is a network, then there might be all sorts of things attached to the network which introduce a higher level of risk, for which the network will have to be protected from backflow. We've got a few sites that we've listed on this slide of the sorts of things where if backflow occurs, can cause problems. So what we are looking at doing is having guidance, hopefully to either supplement or work through some of the guidance that is out there from the industry to make it very clear to a water supplier what are the activities on a consumer site that would warrant backflow protection. Backflow protection can be a device. It can also be an air gap. So going back to our rural sector, a site that has a privately owned tank with an air gap, the air gap can protect that network. Next slide, please. Right. So this slide, we talk about responsibilities. So a water supplier is responsible for providing safe water to their consumers. And so that includes the downstream supplier. If the downstream supplier is receiving water from another supplier, which we call the upstream supplier, and they're responsible for their bit to make sure that the people at the end of the line actually have safe water. For compliance purposes, the downstream supplier will have options available. They must either follow the drinking water quality assurance rules and have a drinking water safety plan, or if it's appropriate, an acceptable solution could well be an option. But the downstream supplier only needs to follow the rules that are relevant to their supply. If the downstream supplier is providing treatment, then the rules that apply to the treatment that is provided. If they've got the distribution system, and we expect that they will, the distribution system rules will again only apply to those risk factors that exist for the supply. So if a water supply has, if downstream supply has a network with fire hydrants and connections that require backflow, but doesn't have a network storage system, then they won't have to. They'll have to worry about the rules for backflow, and including the rules around accessing fire hydrants. They will not have to meet the storage rule if none exists. So we have this year released a set of Drinking Water Quality Assurance Rules 2026. And downstream supplies have been added to that rule set as a standalone category in an effort to make it transparent and clear what water suppliers will have to do or will have to meet to achieve compliance. So we've got downstream supplies being identified as three types. We've got our network supplies where treatment is provided. We've got network supplies that receive treated water and simply distribute that treated water, and there are certain circumstances where a downstream supply could be a self-supplied building. And an example like that is a campground, which is contained on one site, could be receiving water from a mixed-use rural supply and would have to treat that water. So you will see that the self-supplied buildings identify treatment. If the self-supplied building doesn't have to treat the water, then they're just a consumer of the water supply. The new rules come into effect on 1st July 2027. So this is all new, and we have a certain period of time to make sure that we are communicating what is in the rules, and that people can come to us and we can try and clarify questions and also produce guidance. The dates that you can see on the bottom of the supply, on the bottom of the slide, the new rules come into effect on 1st July 2027. So if the downstream supply is currently registered, and we have a few that transitioned over when we were formed, then compliance has to be met from 1st of July 2027. If there is a new supply that's constructed, that new supply will have to comply from the point of view they start delivering water. So that's from 1 July 2027. But if we've got an existing supply that was operating and not registered prior to the passage of the Water Services Act, the dates that apply are the same as those in the transition provisions of the Act, which currently those supplies will have until 2028 to register and 2030 to comply. Upstream suppliers also have responsibilities, and the key thing for us is to make sure that everybody gets safe water. Because of the way the Water Services Act is written, the upstream supplier has to provide safe water to the point of connection with the downstream supply. Now, we recognise that there are certain supplies where that is not the case, and we have published a mixed-use rural acceptable solution where it is impracticable and unreasonable for a mixed-use rural supply to treat all the water that they're producing, most of which will not be used for drinking purposes. In the event that a water supply cannot provide safe water to the point of connection with the downstream supply, and then the downstream supply is treating that water themselves, and there are a few cases that we know where this happens, then the upstream supplier will need an exemption. We are looking at ways that we can do this to make it reasonably easy for a supply in that position. If an upstream supplier is providing treated water that meets all the and that upstream supplier is typically meeting all the duties under the Water Services Act, there's always a chance that something could go wrong. And if there is a problem, that means that the downstream supplier may be receiving unsafe or non-compliant water, then the upstream supplier must notify their consumers and must also notify the downstream supplier to make sure that any consumer advisory that's there just to address a specific issue is sent out to all the people who will be affected. Next slide, please. So what's next? We do have a period of time where we can make sure that the things that the sector needs and we need are in place. From, well, it was last month, we are actively working on guidance for the new rules, and that includes downstream supplies. So from now, we've said until February, but I'm sure this will continue. We will be receiving queries and responding to them and identifying things that we need to do in our own internal systems to make sure that we are set up for everything that we need. We are actively working on guidance, and there's a couple of items there where we have identified that guidance to support the new rules for downstream suppliers are needed. From the point of view of a drinking water supplier who thinks that a downstream supply exists, the supplier can review the policy statement anytime now. It is up on our website. The supplier can also review the updated 2026 rules and put in place anything that needs to be put in place for future compliance. The downstream supplier will be expected to report on the performance, the compliance of the water supply from July 2027. Now, we're not expecting a report to be received on the 1st of that month, but the preparation is in place so that reports can be received based on the size of the supply. So typically that's a monthly report for some things, a quarterly report for some things, or an annual report. And